too want to extend a happy Mother's Day to everyone watching, and we are so glad that you've tuned in wherever you're at in the world for week 2 of our series, PRISM, Faith Through Others' Eyes. Last week we heard from our friend Brian McLaren talking about how we as Christians can better interact with our pluralistic interfaith world. And today I'm really excited to bring you an interview I did with Rabbi Jeffrey Summit, who is a professor at Tufts University and a rabbi who has been working at this intersection of ethnomusicology and Judaism for his entire career. So today's conversation isn't just a glimpse into what does it mean to be Jewish, but it's also a bit of a glimpse into Jewish liturgical practices and Jewish worship and the music that comes from the Jewish people. If you don't know much about Judaism, it is the thing that gave birth to the Christian movement. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are called the Abrahamic faiths because we all trace our roots back to Abraham the prophet. Abraham makes his first appearance in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis chapter 12, and in the New Testament, he's lauded as the person that we should be aiming to be faithful like, because he trusted God and it was counted unto him righteousness. The Jewish people are an ancient people. And the Jewish identity is multi-layered. There's a Jewish religious identity, an ethnic identity, and then there's a Jewish national identity associated with the state of Israel. And I'll talk to Rabbi Summit a bit about that and how we can better understand that. And if you don't know, the Jewish people, again, use what we call the Old Testament in Christianity. They call it the Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures, the Torah, and it's obviously written in Hebrew. And in most synagogues, these are read as liturgical texts. But also what's really interesting, and again, what we'll talk about with Rabbi Summit, is that the way Jewish rabbis and the Jewish tradition engages with Scripture is very different from the ways most Christians engage with Scripture. They actually use this book called the Talmud, which is basically a series of debates by a bunch of rabbis over a really long period of time about different texts in the Bible. And they basically see the Bible as a text to be argued with, to be looked at from various perspectives. They believe that the text always yields new meaning. And the Talmud is this really interesting, very inspiring book to read because it's a commentary on the scriptures that gives fresh life to them and fresh interpretation. I think we Christians can learn a lot from how our Jewish forerunners in the faith engage with the text. And again, this is a topic we'll touch on today in the interview. But really, what I want us to know as we enter into this interview is that it is really important in this period of our history for us to learn and engage with and understand our Jewish siblings in faith. Because we know that today anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world. And as Christians, we're culpable in a lot of that. So much of our tradition, even back to the Great Reformation and the reformers like Martin Luther, perpetuated anti-Semitic theology and stereotypes. And we need to stand with our Jewish siblings against this hatred. And we need to stand up first by understanding, by learning about the faith that they've passed on to us. Because as we like to remember, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. From his birth to his death through his resurrection, he was Jewish, is Jewish. We worship the Messiah, who is Jewish through and through. So today, I hope as we engage in this conversation with Rabbi Jeffrey Summit, your eyes will be opened and that we'll be able to better empathize and understand how to relate to our Jewish siblings in the faith. So with all of that said, here is my interview with Rabbi Jeffrey Summit. First of all, Rabbi Jeffrey Summit, thank you so much for taking time to join us here at Mission Gathering San Diego this morning. You're all the way on the other side of the country, and one of the highlights of this time, even though it's quite a bad time for us, but we do get to make these virtual connections. So I'm grateful to be able to connect with you. And I just wanted to ask, first and foremost, what does it mean to you to be Jewish?
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the invitation. And for me, my Judaism is really based in a number of locales. One of them is very, very much my connection to history, and I'm very conscious that what I do in my life as a person who was born in the 20th century and could be important, it could be, impactful. But I'm so connected back through a links of connection over history that connect me to generations of my family who were in Europe before, and that go back and back and back further. I've lived in Jerusalem for about 3 years altogether with my wife. Actually, my wife and I met in Jerusalem. And to have that connection back to a tradition that's an ancient tradition and an evolving tradition. And, you know, I'm part of a liberal strange of Judaism. So my ordination was from the Reform movement, which is a movement that believes that Judaism should continue to evolve and be connected to tradition, but should also find meaning and connection in the modern world. And I would argue historically that that's how Jews and Judaism managed to survive for the last 3,000 years, because each Judaism evolved and was different depending on the time. So history is one part. Another part of my connection to Judaism is very much in community. And one of the hardest things during this coronavirus crisis is not being able to gather an actual community with my very dear friends. And I belong to a congregation that we call a chavurah. A chavurah is sort of like a house church. It's, there are maybe 15 rabbis who belong, but there's no rabbi in the congregation. We all take turns leading services and giving sermons and doing the physical things that it takes to have a congregation come together in prayer. But that community is so much more than praying together. It's also supporting one another in easy times and wonderful celebrations, and in the hardest times. One of the most heartbreaking things right now in this COVID crisis is not being able to gather both to celebrate weddings and bar and bat mitzvahs and life cycle events, but also when tragedy hits. And this morning, one of my dearest friends, who's also a rabbi in town, called me up to tell me that his dad passed away. Not from COVID. His dad was 94 years old, but his dad was amazing. He was just a active 94-year-old guy who would go into his law office every day. And Alan's not going to be able to do all the rituals that we do. Funerals are the same, and I know that in your community now that you can't gather for a funeral or the graveside. But, in the Jewish tradition, we have the tradition of sitting Shiva. Shiva comes from the number 7. So you stay in your home. Now everybody's staying in their homes, but you stay in your home for 7 days, and the entire community gathers and brings food and brings comfort, and you pray together and you talk together. And sometimes friends of mine who aren't Jewish who go to a Shiva for the first time get very flummoxed. They say that felt like a party, that, because people were laughing and telling stories. And I say, yeah, that's how we do it. We cry together, but we also support one another and joke and tell stories about the person who passed away and offer support for the people who were going through the difficult time of mourning. And so that strength of community is a huge part too. And I'd say the third part connected to my Judaism is very much a way to practice and perform my spiritual connection to the world. In the Jewish tradition, we often do this by saying blessings. You say, and many of my Christian friends are conscious of some of the blessings that people say, like before you break bread, you say, blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe. Maybe a better translation that I like would be, blessed are you, source of creation, whose presence fills the entire world. And then in a blessing, you say something specific about what you're doing, who brings forth bread from the earth. And so those are certain kinds of blessings, but there's a mystical tradition in Judaism that says that a Jew should say 100 blessings a day, which means that you should constantly be attuned to the wonders of the world and the spirituality of the world. And there are blessings over wine and blessings over bread, but there are also blessings when you see a beautiful thing in nature, or you get special enjoyment, or you study with people, or you have a wonderful conversation, and or when you see the trees like they are here in Boston blossoming for the first time in the spring. And so saying blessings and bringing God's presence into my acknowledgement of the world is a big part. So for instance, we're very fortunate to live on a little pond here in Newton, Massachusetts, where I'm. And if I turned my computer around, I could show you this pond right outside. And there's 2 blue herons who live on the pond. And this morning when I woke up, the herons were gliding across the pond, and I said the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oseh ma'aseh bereshit. Blessed are you, Holy One, whose presence fills creation, who renews the work of creation every day. Now, I guess I could have just said, whoa, look at those herons, they're really beautiful. And that would have been a blessing in its own right. But if I acknowledge God's presence in the world connected to these miracles, I'm saying that there's something much larger that pulls everything together. And I want to be thankful for it. I want to live my life. And so for me, my Jewish tradition, whether it's the holidays or Shabbat, the Sabbath, gives me a structure to think about holiness in my life.
Totally. That's a beautiful way of looking at things. It's the 100 blessings in a day. It's like that mindfulness of keeping ourselves open to the presence of God. That's something in even our tradition where we try to cultivate. But I think there's also a beauty of being connected to that ancient prayer that has been spoken by billions of people for thousands of years. That's profound. And I wonder, how do you? I saw that you've taught courses on the Talmud. And how do you, in your particular strain of Judaism, relate to scriptures and relate to the texts of your faith?
Right. I'm if I was going to characterize myself, I'd say I'm an Aristotelian rationalist. I believe in science. I believe in the natural world. But I believe that, I've never seen any conflict at all between science and the natural world. And every scientist or physicist I know tends to go around going, whoa, this is all incredible, and they're comfortable with the fact that there's mystery behind this and surrounding it. So while I'm a rationalist, I also really believe, if somebody asks me, do I believe in God? My answer is I totally believe in God, but when I say I believe in God, I'm making a statement that I am not alone in the world. I am not the person who's running the show. I have a really good friend, a teacher, Rabbi Larry Kushner. You might know his work. He's a wonderful writer. He lives in San Francisco. And Larry asked the question, in the Jewish tradition, he says, what's the commandment in the first commandment? Because the first commandment is, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt to be your God. So where's the commandment in it? It's not like don't steal or don't commit adultery, or, and Larry's take on it is, here's the commandment. The commandment is, remember, I'm God, you're not. You're not God. Because human beings have a terrible tendency to think that they're God. And as soon as we think that we're God, we start pouring chemicals into our lakes and our rivers, and we start bombing people, and we start oppressing people, and we start saying we're better than this people or that people, or, and, in our tradition, it says human beings were created in the image of God. And it doesn't say white people were created in the image of God. It doesn't say Jews were created in the image of God. It doesn't say straight people were created in the image of God. It says humans were created with holiness in them. Every single human being was created with holiness. And so understanding and believing in God for me is understanding that there is an intrinsic holiness to our being that we have to honor, and we have to treat other human beings as if there's a spark of the Holy One in that being, So for me, for scripture, for the Torah, I have no problem at all in thinking that the Torah was a document that over the last 3,000 years has been edited and modified, and people added things to it. But when I was in college, before I went to rabbinical school, my major was English literature. And I love literature, and I've read a lot of literature. And I've just got to say, I've been reading the Bible, I've been reading Torah for many years now, and there's something really extraordinary about it. New meanings come up all the time. The rabbi said, turn it over, you'll always find something new in it. And so for me, scripture and the study of scripture is a methodology to go deeper into understanding holiness in the world. And but I really don't like, that's an understatement, it really bothers me profoundly when people try to cherry pick different parts of the Bible and base a theology on one verse or another verse without understanding a larger context to it. And I'll just say, in terms of LGBTQ issues, because this is part of our family, and when somebody would quote to me the material in Leviticus about, and about homosexuality being a toeva, an abomination, and getting all self-righteous about it, I say, I like to point out that, the laws for keeping kosher are also in the exact same list. And you're there eating a ham sandwich, and, so why are you privileging that line and not the other line right here? And you can't take something out of a document that was written 3,000 years ago and not understand the context and elevate one part over another part. We have to be able to study the document as it's lived and interpreted over the years to find the meaning to it. And the other thing I'd add to that is that in the Jewish tradition, as you know well, Judaism is not a biblical religion. Judaism is a religion of the commentaries, the rabbinic commentaries, the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara that make up the Talmud, the commentaries that evolved the practices that were first spelled out in the Bible. But if Judaism followed everything in the Torah, we'd still be offering animal sacrifices, and we're not, like prayer replaced sacrifice in the Jewish, tradition. And there are many, this could be a whole course on this, but so I think there's great meaning and wisdom in scripture, but one also has to be very careful about using it as a club to hit people over the head with, because I never think it was meant to be used in that way.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. And I just wish more of my tradition would recognize the way that Judaism has, as you said, always seen the scripture almost as a living text that is evolving, that is meant to have new meanings and new interpretations, because as we're all very aware of, there are very many people in the evangelical tradition, for instance, that want to take it literally as it was written 4,000 years ago, supposedly, and apply that same principle that doesn't make sense in our modern context. And so I think it'd be refreshing if more Christians took some time to look at the Talmud and see how the Jewish tradition has engaged scripture.
And of course, I should just say that just as Christianity is not monolithic, and there's many approaches, neither is Judaism. And there's certainly parts of my tradition, like that are much more fundamentalist and ultra orthodox, look at this in quite a different way than conservative and reform and Reconstructionist Jews. But even a lot of the modern Orthodox Jews understand the evolving nature of Torah.
Totally. And one question that comes up whenever I'm in interfaith settings talking particularly about Judaism is that in a very unique way, to be Jewish has multiple layers, right? It's an ethnic identity, it's a national identity, it's a religious identity. I wonder how you, individually, but also if you can speak to your particular tradition, how do those identities work together? What does it mean to be associated with the state of Israel and also be ethnically Jewish and religiously Jewish?
Yeah, I mean, you ask a tremendously complicated question. The great Jewish thinker Mordecai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, struggled so hard to define Judaism that he finally, because it wasn't a religion, and it wasn't a culture, and it wasn't a literature, and he finally defined Judaism as a civilization. And he wrote a book by that name, Judaism as a Civilization. But I think that it's just multi-layered, So for me, Jewish culture and art and music is very, very important. And it's, the culture's connected to the food and the culture, and the way we celebrate. And, it's also very diverse. So my family comes from, has Eastern European origins, Western and Eastern European, Austria and Russia and Romania for that matter. But my wife's family are Sephardic Jews, and her family comes from Spain and Greece. And often Jews are so different that the first time I had Passover at her home, I sort of said, "Are you guys sure you're Jewish?" Because it was so different. It was, they ate different foods, and they did the Seder in Ladino, in Spanish and Hebrew, not in Hebrew and Yiddish, German and Hebrew. And so cultures are very multi-leveled. Also, the connection to Israel is a really interesting and important one. I have a very deep connection to Israel as a place and as a history and the Hebrew language. But that doesn't mean that I'm a huge supporter of the current government in Israel, or that for years on campuses I worked, because for many years I was a campus rabbi at Tufts University. I worked to bring Israelis and Palestinians together in productive dialogue, because my profound understanding is that there's going to be no peace in Israel until there's peace for both Palestinians and for Israelis. And I want there to be I certainly want there to be a Jewish state, and I believe that there should be a Jewish state. But this land is a land where two peoples have lived for years, and so for like for millennia, and and so the concept that there should also be a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with the Jewish state of Israel is something that I believe very deeply, and that in no way is anomalous with my love and connection to Israel. It's not that different from my connection to America, to the United States. I feel very patriotic and I love our country very much, but that doesn't mean that I'm a supporter of everything that our government, does. And I think that our connections to national projects have to be taken very critically, and we have to look at them through lenses of righteousness and justice for for all people. It's and I very deeply believe if and this was the message of Passover that just finished up. If all people aren't liberated, then no one is liberated.
Yeah, totally. And I think, again, the Jewish tradition has such a long heritage of that prophetic voice speaking truth to power and calling for liberation. So I think, as you point in Passover, that's just very apt, especially for this present moment that we're in. So I'm going to throw this question at you, just talking about this interfaith connection. How do you personally, as a rabbi, as a Jewish person, think of Jesus? When you think of Jesus, what comes to your mind?
Right. Nice Jewish boy. First thing, it's I wish more Christians totally understood that Jesus was Jewish and that Christianity grew out of Judaism. I think that when I think of Jesus as one of the great rabbinic teachers of of that time in Israel, Palestine. The big difference between Judaism as it emerged and emerging Christianity had to do with the concept of how people understood the Messiah. And I have no doubt that among Jesus's followers, it was clear that they had experiences that for them proved that Jesus was the Mashiach, the Messiah. In the Jewish mainstream tradition, the concept of the Messiah was that when the Messiah arrived, the world would be set right, and there would be justice, and there would be peace. So mainstream Jews at that time looked at after Jesus' crucifixion and by the Romans, and that the Romans were crucifying thousands of people. They said, the road from Jerusalem to Caesarea to the sea was lined with crucified, teachers and rabble-rousers and social activists and, all in the tradition of Jesus, who preached a different rule than the Roman rule. And so when the world did not end up with peace and justice at that time, the Jewish community of the time said, well, that didn't fit our understanding of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. But clearly for Jesus' followers, the apostles and the disciples had a profound experience that was different than that. And they saw Jesus in that way, and they began to preach the gospel that was basically, the way I look at it, it was Jewish teaching, but without a lot of the ritual aspects, because the Greek world was not about to take on circumcision and keeping kosher, but the ethical practices and understandings and the loving your neighbor and creating societies of love and connection. Those were values that early Christianity taught and embraced, that really grew out of its connection to Jewish teachings, and then seen through the lens of Greek philosophy and teaching at the same time. And so I never, um, I, I never was that bothered by the fact that spiritually there's different roads up the mountain. The question is, do the roads get you to the place where you're going to be a loving person who respects and protects other people? And like my question when evangelical Christians, many of whom I'm friendly with, try to convert me, or I mean, they don't really try to convert me because they know I'm a rabbi and I'm not going to come over easily. My sort of bottom line is, I don't want this to sound crass, but but my Jewish history of persecution has said, how far are you going to take this? Like, are you going to listen to me? Are we going to respectfully disagree, or will you kill me if I don't convert? And that's a real question if you're Jewish and you're a student of history, because there were lots of times when that did happen. And so, if people are able, I want to know people by their acts, and if people's acts ideally are connected with love and connection, then I could learn a great deal, as I do always, from my Christian brothers and sisters who preach a gospel of love and a gospel of justice. I have no problem with that. The fact that we're both messianic religions, we're just waiting for the Messiah to come. Christianity believes that the Messiah had come and the world wasn't ready for the Messiah. And so Christianity is waiting for the Messiah to come again. The question is, how do we create a society that's where the Messiah is able to feel comfortable in that society? Could we welcome her or him back into a world that is going to treat people with respect and care more about people's body than about their souls? I want people to care more about my body ultimately than my soul. I'll take care of my own soul, thank you. But I want you to protect my body. I want to protect your body. I want to protect your safety. I want to keep you from harm. What you ultimately believe, that's the holiness of difference.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the last, and you've kind of already touched on it, but to kind of wrap this up, if you could speak, and you are speaking, to a group of Christians, a group of progressive Christians, of how we can better relate and work together and support our Jewish siblings, whether religious or not, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think people need to spend time in fellowship together. I think people need to invite people into their homes. I think people need to come together and create opportunities to talk about what they don't understand about different traditions and have them explain it. One of the, I think, most productive interfaith programs that I ran at Tufts together with the Protestant chaplain and the Catholic chaplain and the Muslim chaplain was, we called it Mutual Misunderstandings. And we just sat down with small groups, 10, 15 people from different faiths. And we had each person say in a respectful way, like what they didn't understand about the other tradition. And then people talked about it and they explained it. And, it's like, why do you do this? And what does it mean to you? And how do you understand the teachings of your faith in your own life, and what is ultimately important, to you? Where do you draw the lines? And I think that the opportunity to really communicate in, like in fellowship, is a very, very precious thing. And I also think that, action really, really speaks the loudest. And if we could create communities where people actually help each other when times are hard and reach out to each other, that's how people learn who other people are.
Totally. I love that. And I do hope in this most polarized moment of our history, at least modern history, we can do a little bit more listening and talking. And I'm grateful that you've made time to come and chat with me and our community. And so, Rabbi Jeffrey Summit, thank you so much for taking some time today.
Pastor, it was a real pleasure. And I wish my wishes to everyone in the congregation, may we have a springtime of liberation when we're out, when we could come out and join together again in face-to-face community and create happy occasions in the world.
Yeah. Amen.